Thank you, Larry. It's a great pleasure and privilege for me to be here with you today. I come from Tallahassee. For those of you who don't know about the James Madison Institute, we are a free market public policy think tank based in the state capitol. We produce a number of research studies and reports and seek to provide good factual information for members of the legislature and other public policy makers at the state level primarily on all sorts of issues that affect Florida, including those that we are dealing with today. And as Larry mentioned, my background is largely in education. I'm a journalist by training and have spent much of my public life tracking trends in education, writing about education research studies and reports and innovations, and then have done a lot of work advising on curriculum and other things of that sort. So I have an extensive background in that, but obviously in any sort of work like that we do in Tallahassee, there's a fair amount of bleed over into and interrelationship between education and other topics, and so I'll seek to do that some today. I must say, I'm delighted to be here. I have not been to Gainesville. I'm a fairly recent transplant to Florida, and I have not been to Gainesville since I was about yay high. And I have many reasons to love this place. I spent about 20 plus years before moving to Florida in the Washington, D.C. area, and the minister who married us there was a huge Gator fan. My best friend there, an attorney, was a graduate of the University of Florida Law School. I spent much of the 80s and 90s during that period listening to a lot of Tom Petty music, so I'm a big fan of your great product. And then, like most people in America, or at least many of us, including some of us who don't root for the Gators, I have been completely captured by the story of Tim Tebow and all that he has done and just the way he's conducted himself in recent years. I should mention, if you didn't know this, that there are reasons why I probably wouldn't like the University of Florida. I am, after all, a University of Georgia grad. I have a son who is finishing this semester at Florida State, and I have a daughter who is absolutely convinced that Tim Tebow stole 2 national championships away from her USC Trojans, including one year when she was a cheerleader and was looking forward to being able to perform at the national championship, and alas, it was not to be. But I mention those things because, as you'll see as we go forward, some of the whining that none of us want to hear about the Trojans and how they may have been robbed actually has some relevance to our discussion, and we'll see how that unfolds. There's several key points that I want to make kind of in a kind of grand way here at the outset, and then I will unpack these as we kind of go forward. But the first is this, that we are now living in an age where it is increasingly possible for people to live and work where they want to. Richard Florida's book, The Rise of the Creative Class, deals with this topic, as do a number of other works, extensively. But this is in some ways unprecedented in human history, because for most of human history, people have followed or have moved to where jobs existed. And those jobs existed in geographic places for particular reasons. You know, they were near transportation sources or near natural resources or other things. We are now living in an age where those things still apply, but where increasingly, especially among knowledge class sorts of workers, the creative class that Florida talks about, it is increasingly possible for people to live where they choose and to communicate via digital technology with people not only around the corner but around the globe. And that, I think, is extremely important for us to recognize as we go forward, because I think it has significant implications for people everywhere. But it also, I think, represents some unusual opportunities for those of us who call Florida home. Because the state of Florida, as you well know, has much to offer people who have the discretion to live wherever they want. This is a place that many people, as you well know, love to come and visit as tourists. Indeed, the economy of our state has been built largely around tourism, agriculture, and growth and development. And that I'm sure will continue to be, but what I think we will increasingly need to do is to look for ways in which we can attract knowledge workers and others to help round out in some ways our economy and to help us especially through tough times like those that we find now, where when economic hardships hit in other places, it has a ripple effect here. But Florida is very much unlike other places that I know that tourists like to visit, which, as the old saying goes, gee, it's a great place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there. I don't find many people who come to visit Florida saying that. I think for many people, the very things that they find attractive about Florida, the climate, the natural resources, the beaches, and all the rest, are apt to be the sorts of things that people are apt to want to live near. The cultural diversity, the rich arts, and the eclectic nature of the population here are also, I think, selling points, because this is a very interesting place to live. And so there is an awful lot that our state has to offer those who might have the discretion to set up businesses in places wherever they wish, or to work independently as knowledge workers in far-flung places. So there are great opportunities for us, but I do think it's going to require us to diversify our economy and to look for ways to build beyond just the emphasis on agriculture, tourism, and development. And I think where we might want to spend particular attention today is on the question of education, because I'm convinced that education is a magnet that is apt to either draw or repel people from a particular state. And I think that there is both some good news for us and for our state as we go forward, and as we look to not just see education as a way of training future workers from within our state, but also as a way of drawing people who are considering various locations for setting up a business or for settling down and living. I think there are some things about our education that are apt to help us, as well as some areas that we need to devote some attention. So that's where I'd like to spend a lot of our time this morning. We're going to spend a little bit here in the first half of the discussion looking at K through 12, where the news is largely good. And then we're going to spend some time in the second half of the presentation looking at higher education, where I think some of the challenges as well as some of the opportunities present themselves, and then we'll circle back at the very end and kind of try to tie all of these things together. In my mind, in the K through 12 arena, there is great opportunity for us to crow. And I don't know that I see people in our state crowing enough about the success that our schools are having. And I think in some respects, as a journalist, I would say this is very much, in my mind, an underreported story. If you look at a lot of the national rankings, and I think in strange ways all the time about analogies or comparisons or parallels between things like education rankings and things like college football rankings. But if you look at college football in the 1980s and 90s, what happened in the state of Florida? 3 different teams, the Miami Hurricanes, the Florida Gators, and the Florida State Seminoles, all emerged in some ways almost out of nowhere to become national powerhouses, and collected between the 3 of them, 8, 9, 10 national championships during those 2 decades, and I guess 3 more during the first decade of the 21st century. And you go back and you look at the records in the 60s and 70s, and you don't find that these were schools that you would have predicted would have made those kind of leaps. And yet they did so in many ways for a couple of reasons. One is that they were not afraid to measure themselves against the very best competition anywhere. And they were also quite willing to innovate and to do things differently than some of the other schools elsewhere were doing, and to gain an advantage. One of the things that I think most people would say was striking about those schools and their rise was the tendency to value defensive speed as much as defensive size, which gave them an advantage over a lot of the Big Ten Farm Belt sorts of schools. Well, in the same way, over the last 10 to 12 years, The K through 12 system here in the state of Florida has emerged as a national leader, as something of a national powerhouse in the area of education. If you look at the most recent rankings of things like the American Legislative Exchange Council's rankings, Education Week's rankings, the rankings of Digital Education Now and others, what you'll find is that the state of Florida now, on performance-based measures, ranks consistently in the top 10 among states in the country. And that's based on reading scores, on the NAEP reading scores, a standardized test taken in all 50 states at the 4th, 8th, 12th grade levels, both in reading and in math. And what you find is that a state that was floundering for many years in the high 30s, low 40s, suddenly catapulted to the very top or near the top. In 2011, Florida was ranked number 3, number 4, and number 5 by those 3 different ranking services that I just mentioned. And I should acknowledge, just as with college football rankings, these rankings are not perfect sorts of rankings. Some of them have their particular problems. In fact, one of them, the Education Week rankings, actually considers funding as a criteria, and the more you fund, the better your score. So in effect, if you do more with less, you in a perverse way end up suffering in your rankings, which is kind of strange. But by and large, nevertheless, these are rankings that provide an indication of how we are doing. And what is particularly interesting about these findings is that they don't just look at or show success among Florida students generally, but if you look at particular populations that have historically struggled, African American students, Latino students, and others, what you find is that Florida's students, minority students, outperform the general population of 20-25 states throughout the country. So what we are seeing is a significant progress in the area of K through 12 education. Doesn't mean that we've arrived, that we have no more problems, no more challenges, or anything of the sort. But it does mean that we have made and are continuing to make significant progress, and that we ought to both crow about that and also, of course, take stock of why that has happened. I think, much like with college football, it has happened in part because of the reforms that began during the Jeb Bush administration, where we saw increasing attention on the importance of meeting high standards and of comparing ourselves and seeking to